All right, so interested in psychology research ethics.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, today we're going deep
Okay.
into Chapter 3 from a psychology research methods textbook.
Sounds good.
And let me tell you, this stuff is pretty juicy.
Okay.
Like we're talking what keeps research ethical.
Oh, interesting.
Because we've all heard those stories about studies gone wrong.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be trying to figure out what separates the good science from the bad science from the questionable science.
Okay.
So to kick things off, maybe you could help us understand, like, where does a researcher's responsibility actually begin?
Well, I think you have to start with this, like, core drive.
Okay.
Scientists are driven by this deep desire for knowledge,
Yeah.
right? And that comes with some serious implications.
Yeah.
Because those findings, what they find, can affect individuals and even entire societies.
That's true, yeah. I mean, it's like they have this duty to use their knowledge for good.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a superhero's code, but for scientists. The textbook even talks about this core mandate for researchers.
Right.
It emphasizes things like competence, honesty, and like really thinking about the consequences of their work.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is the potential for negative consequences.
Okay.
And think about certain medical studies in the past.
Yeah?
Sometimes research, although they had really good intentions, sometimes it has some unintended and like harmful side effects.
Right.
And it's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Yeah.
But of course, on the flip side, research has also led to incredible breakthroughs.
Right.
I mean, where would we be without the discoveries that led to new treatments, our understanding of human behavior, and all the technological advances? I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, it's incredible.
So we've got this responsibility, but how do we make sure that it stays ethical?
Well, that's where the guidelines come in.
Okay.
And
Speaking of guidelines, the textbook mentions this thing called the APA Ethics Code. And let me tell you, this thing is massive.
oh, yeah.
It's not just about research. It covers everything.
Yeah.
From handling fees to giving advice in the media.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
Like, it lays out this framework for being an ethical psychologist in any part of the profession.
Right. So it can help researchers navigate a lot of tricky situations.
Okay.
Especially when ethical considerations kind of clash.
Okay.
Like imagine you're a researcher who uncovers something groundbreaking
Okay.
about addiction. You want to share this knowledge,
Yeah.
but publishing the details could compromise the anonymity of your participants.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where you have to weigh like the benefits versus the risks.
It's like walking a tightrope, right?
It is, yeah.
How do they find that balance?
Well, it's called the risk-benefit ratio.
Okay.
And it's something every researcher has to think about very carefully.
Mhm.
There's no simple formula or anything like that.
Okay.
It's all about thoroughly evaluating the potential harms and benefits of a study.
Yeah.
And here's something that you might not have considered.
Okay.
Even the quality of the research plays a role in ethics.
Wait, what do you mean? How can the quality of the research be an ethical issue?
Well, think about it. If a study's poorly designed or executed, it's not going to produce meaningful results.
Right.
So you've basically wasted everyone's time and resources.
Oh, okay.
The participants, the researchers, the funding agencies.
Right.
So ethically, you have a responsibility to ensure that your research is rigorous.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It connects back to that idea that researchers have a duty to use their knowledge and resources wisely.
Yeah.
So it's not just about avoiding harm.
Right.
It's also about maximizing the potential for good.
Absolutely.
So with those risks, how do we categorize them? Like, what kind of risks are there?
Yeah, so you have to think beyond just physical risks.
Okay.
There's social risks, like the potential for embarrassment or damage to someone's reputation if personal information were to be revealed.
Right.
And then you also have psychological risks,
Okay.
like experiencing emotional distress during a study.
So how do researchers determine if a study's too risky? Like, is there a line?
Well, it's not always black and white,
Okay.
but researchers use the concept of minimal risk
Okay.
as a guide. And essentially, minimal risk means if a participant experiences harm or discomfort,
Yeah.
it's no greater than what they might encounter in their everyday lives.
Oh, okay.
So like,
So like a study involving like a computerized personality test would probably be considered minimal risk.
right.
Because it's not really more stressful than taking like an exam in a college course or something like that.
Right, exactly.
But Like if a study was asking people to relive traumatic experiences.
Yeah, that would be a very different situation.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So we've covered this core mandate of a researcher, and we've talked about the importance of balancing the risks and benefits, and we've talked about all these different types of risks that can arise. So what's next on the ethical checklist?
Well, next we have to talk about one of the foundational principles of ethical research, informed consent.
Okay, yeah. Informed consent, that's all about making sure participants understand what they're signing up for, right? It's like a contract
Yes.
between the researcher and the participant and make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. It's more than just a signature on a form, though.
Okay.
It's about providing a clear explanation of the research procedures, identifying anything that might influence someone's willingness to participate,
Okay.
like potential risks or benefits, and giving them a chance to ask questions.
Right.
And it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
Participants can withdraw from a study at any time.
But what happens when you can't get true informed consent?
Okay.
Like what if you're doing research with children or people who can't fully understand a study?
That's where things get a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
You need to get consent from a legal guardian, but you should still try to get assent from the participant themselves.
So even if they might not understand all the details of the study.
Right.
You know.
It's about respecting their autonomy
Yeah.
as much as possible,
Got
even within, the limitations.
And this whole informed consent thing gets even more complex when you think about online research.
Yeah.
Because how can you be sure someone actually read that consent form before they hit, like, agree?
Yeah, those are some of the big questions researchers are wrestling with.
Right.
As online research becomes more prevalent,
Yeah.
it's kind of forcing us to rethink, traditional notions of informed consent.
Yeah. It's like the Wild West of research ethics out there.
A little bit, yeah.
But speaking of ethical challenges, let's tackle one of the most debated issues in research.
Okay.
Deception.
Yeah.
Is it ever okay for a researcher to lie to their participants?
It's definitely one of the most controversial topics.
Okay.
And there are strong arguments against using deception. Some people believe it's just inherently wrong, no matter what.
Yeah.
Others worry that deception erodes trust in science
Yeah.
and makes people less likely to participate in the future.
I can see that. But the textbook also presents this counter-argument,
Right.
like this idea of deception as a technical illusion.
Oh, interesting.
It was a term coined by Stanley Milgram,
Okay.
who conducted those famous obedience studies.
Oh, yeah, right.
And he argued that, sometimes a little bit of deception is actually necessary to get at the truth,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting.
It is a fascinating argument.
Yeah.
And the Milgram obedience studies
Yeah.
are a perfect example of how deception can be used to study really important questions.
Okay, so walk me through this Milgram study. What actually happened?
Okay, so imagine you're a participant
Okay.
in Milgram's study. You show up at the lab, you're told that you're participating in a learning experiment.
Okay.
You're assigned the role of the teacher, and another participant, who is actually an actor, is the learner.
Okay.
And your task is to test the learner's memory and deliver an electric shock every time he makes a mistake.
And this was back in the 1960s, right?
Right.
Before we had, all the ethical guidelines we have today.
Yeah.
So did they really shock the participants?
No, the shocks were fake.
Okay.
But the participant didn't know that. They believed that they were delivering real shocks.
Right.
And the learner would cry out in pain with each shock.
Okay, so that's a bit unsettling. What were they actually trying to figure out with this setup?
Milgram wanted to understand how far people would go in obeying an authority figure,
Okay.
even if it meant harming another person.
Okay.
So he was interested in the psychological factors that contribute to obedience,
Okay.
especially when people are pressured to act against their conscience.
So what were the results? Did people actually go through with it?
The results were shocking.
Oh, wow.
Over 65% of participants continued to deliver shocks,
Wow.
even when the learner seemed to be in extreme pain,
Wow, that's intense.
just because the researcher told them to.
So it showed how powerful the influence of authority can be,
Absolutely.
even in situations that seem morally wrong.
Right.
So that is pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the ethics of putting people through that kind of experience.
Definitely. The Milgram studies sparked a lot of debate about the ethical limits of deception.
Right.
People argued that it's never okay to deceive someone into participating in a study that could cause psychological harm.
Okay, so is there ever a time when deception is acceptable in research?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
The APA Ethics Code does allow for deception under certain circumstances.
Okay.
But it's not a decision that researchers take lightly. There
Okay.
has to be a really good reason.
Uh-huh.
And it has to be justified by the potential benefits.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
But even then, don't researchers have a responsibility to minimize any harm?
Absolutely. If a researcher decides to use deception,
Yeah.
they have to take steps to make sure it doesn't cause undue stress or harm.
Right.
They also have to debrief participants afterwards, explaining the true nature of the study
All right.
and why the deception was necessary.
Debriefing sounds like a really important part of this process.
It is, yeah.
Especially when deception's involved.
Yeah.
Like it's giving the participants a chance to process what happened
Yeah.
and make sense of their experience.
Exactly. And it also gives the researcher a chance to kind of learn from the participants' perspectives.
Oh, okay.
You know, did the deception work?
Yeah.
Did participants interpret the situation correctly?
Right.
So it's a valuable opportunity for both.
But what about debriefing in online research? I imagine that's a lot trickier
Oh, yeah.
since you don't have that face-to-face interaction.
It does present some new challenges.
Okay.
How do you make sure participants actually read the debriefing information?
Right.
How do you create a sense of closure?
Yeah.
Especially if a participant is distressed. You know, those are all things to consider.
Yeah. It seems like researchers are constantly having to adapt and innovate to keep pace with all these changes in research, especially online.
Right.
But, like, regardless of the format, it seems like these ethical practices are just paramount.
They are, absolutely. Ethical considerations are at the heart of good research.
Right.
No matter where it's conducted.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the core mandate of a researcher
Mm-hmm.
to this whole idea of informed consent and deception and debriefing.
Right.
And we've even touched on some of these new challenges that are coming up online.
Right.
But there's another big ethical issue.
Okay.
We need to address
Yeah.
animal research.
Yeah.
And I know this one's a bit of a minefield.
It can be a little tricky, yeah.
It's a very complex issue
Uh-huh.
with very strong opinions on both sides.
Absolutely.
So I guess maybe we should start with the basics.
Okay.
Like, why are animals even used in research in the first place? What's the rationale?
Yeah, so animals are used for a variety of reasons,
Okay.
many of which ultimately aim to benefit human health and well-being.
Okay.
They can help us understand diseases,
Yeah. Okay.
develop new treatments, and study behaviors and processes that are just difficult or impossible to study in humans.
Okay.
So, for example, you know, animal research has been super important
Yeah.
for developing vaccines for diseases like polio and measles,
Right.
as well as treatments for things like cancer and heart disease.
So where do we draw the line?
Right.
Like, is any kind of research on animals acceptable?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it's one that's been debated for decades, really.
Yeah.
Researchers have a really clear ethical obligation
Okay.
to minimize pain and suffering in animals
Okay.
and to use alternatives whenever possible.
Okay.
And there are really strict regulations in place
Right.
to govern animal research,
Right.
including, you know, oversight from committees that review the studies.
So it's not like they can just do whatever they want with the animal.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
They have to follow really specific guidelines
Yeah.
to ensure that they're treated humanely.
Yeah.
And they have to justify using animals.
Right.
Like, show that there's no other way to answer their question,
Okay.
you know?
But some people would argue that animal research has no value because we don't always see the immediate benefit to humans.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
I think the counter argument to that is if we only focused on research with immediate applications,
Yeah.
then we'd stifle all kinds of basic research that could lead to breakthroughs.
Oh, okay.
You know, later on. It's like saying we shouldn't fund research on a new type of cell
Yeah.
because we don't know yet if it will cure cancer.
Right.
But you could be missing out on something huge.
Right.
You
It's
think?
the balancing act, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Like weighing the potential benefits against the ethical concern.
Yeah, and it's a debate that continues to evolve, especially as we, you know, develop new technologies and we learn more about animal cognition.
Absolutely.
You know?
So we've explored the complexities of this, but it seems like ethical considerations don't just end when the data is collected.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
They also apply to how the research is reported, right?
You do.
Because we talked about the importance of authorship
Yeah.
and making sure you're giving credit where credit's due.
Right.
But there's also the issue of plagiarism,
Yes.
and that can be a tricky area.
Right, for sure.
even for experienced researchers.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people have this misconception that plagiarism is just about copying and pasting
Oh,
someone else's work, like
yeah.
word for word.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more nuanced than that, right?
Yeah, it is. Plagiarism can take many forms.
Okay.
Some are a lot more subtle,
Okay.
but the principle is the same. You can't present someone else's ideas or words
Right.
as your own.
So let's break this down. Like, what are some types of plagiarism that people need to be aware of?
Okay, well, like you said, there's that most blatant type, direct plagiarism,
Okay.
where you're copying someone else's work word for word
Right.
without giving them credit.
Right.
This one's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
If you use someone else's words, put it in quotes, cite the source.
Okay. That one's pretty easy. What about paraphrasing?
Right.
If I'm putting someone else's idea in my own words.
You still have to cite them.
Okay. Okay.
Even if you're not using the exact words,
Gotcha.
you need to acknowledge the source of the idea,
Okay.
because paraphrasing without attribution
Yeah.
is still plagiarism.
Okay.
And then there's this thing called mosaic plagiarism,
Okay.
which is kind of a sneaky one,
Okay.
where you take little bits and pieces from different sources
Yeah.
and you patch them together without citing them.
Like a Frankenstein's monster of other people's ideas.
Yeah, exactly. It's just as unethical as directly copying.
Okay.
And whether you're doing it intentionally or just careless,
Yeah.
it's still a big no-no.
Okay. So we've covered copying directly, paraphrasing without attributing, and now mosaic plagiarism.
Right,
But what about the gray areas? Like, what if it's common knowledge?
right.
Do I still need to cite it?
Well, it depends.
Okay.
If it's something that's really widely known in your field,
Yeah.
you might not need to cite it.
Okay.
But if you're unsure,
Okay.
always err on the side of caution
Okay.
and cite your source.
So when in doubt, cite it out.
Exactly. And remember, even accidental plagiarism
Yeah.
can have serious consequences.
Okay.
It can damage your reputation, harm your career,
Yeah.
and even undermine your research.
All right. So we've covered a ton of ground here,
We have.
from the core mandate
Mm-hmm.
to informed consent, deception, debriefing,
Right.
animal research, plagiarism. I think the question on everyone's mind is, how does a researcher actually make a decision
Yeah.
when faced with a real ethical dilemma? Because it's one thing to read about it in a textbook,
Right.
but it's another thing to actually apply it in the real world.
Absolutely.
So what are those steps?
Well, the first step is to gather all the facts.
Okay.
Who are the participants?
Right.
What are the procedures?
Yeah.
What are the risks and benefits?
Yeah.
Once you understand the situation,
Okay.
you can identify the relevant ethical issues.
All right.
Think of it as like a thorough ethical inventory,
Okay.
you know?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like building a case file before making a judgment.
Right.
So what comes next?
Well, the next step is crucial.
Okay.
You have to consider multiple viewpoints.
Oh, okay.
How might the research impact the participants, the researchers, the institution,
Okay.
even society as a whole?
Right.
It's about stepping outside your own perspective
Yeah.
and really trying to see it from every angle.
That sounds like a pretty complex process.
Yeah.
And like, I imagine it's not always easy to balance all those viewpoints
Right.
and come to a clear decision.
It's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
And it's not about finding the answer that makes everyone happy.
Okay.
It's about carefully weighing all those factors
Yeah.
and making a decision that aligns with ethical principles,
Okay.
even if it's a tough choice.
The textbook mentions a replication of the Milgram study
Oh, okay.
by a researcher named Jerry Berger.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds like he had to go through quite a process to get that study approved.
He did, yeah. It's a great example of how researchers can balance those ethical concerns
Okay.
with the research goals.
So tell us a bit more about Berger's study. What did he do differently from Milgram?
Well, first of all, Berger carefully screened participants
Yeah.
to make sure they weren't at risk for psychological harm.
Okay.
He also explicitly told them they could withdraw at any time
Okay.
without any penalty. And probably most importantly, he stopped the study at a much lower voltage than Milgram did.
Okay.
You know, he wanted to see if he could still get obedience without putting people through the same stress.
So he basically built in all these extra safeguards.
Yeah,
Okay.
to protect them.
And it was still approved.
It was, which is a testament to his commitment to ethics.
Yeah.
You know?
I'm curious about the results.
Yeah.
Like, was he able to replicate Milgram's findings even with all these modifications?
Yes, he was. Even though the study was stopped earlier, he still found a similar level of obedience.
So it suggests that the power of authority is still a strong force.
Yeah.
Okay.
even in more ethical research settings.
That's fascinating. It
Yeah.
seems like researchers are always trying to find that sweet spot,
Right.
pushing the boundaries of knowledge
Yeah.
while staying true to these ethical principles.
It's a delicate dance,
Yeah.
but it's essential.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive into the world of research ethics so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the responsibility of scientists to the complexities of informed consent, deception, and debriefing. We've even explored the ethical considerations involved in animal research and the importance of giving credit where credit's due when reporting research findings.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I think we've really highlighted how important it is to approach research with a keen ethical awareness.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And remember, listeners, ethical decision-making isn't just for scientists. It's something we all face in our daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So stay tuned as we continue to dive into this important topic.
Sounds good. It's interesting to think about how these ethical considerations, sometimes it can feel like they're slowing down the research process,
Right.
but in reality, they're crucial for making sure that the research is valid and meaningful.
Okay.
It's like the guardrails
Okay.
that keep us on track.
That's a great analogy. Like building a house, you can't just throw it together.
Right.
Without a solid foundation, you need blueprints, building codes, inspections, all those things that ensure the structure is safe and sound.
Exactly. Ethical guidelines are like the blueprint for research.
Yeah.
They provide that framework
Yeah.
for doing studies responsibly.
So we've talked about how to make these ethical decisions, but what happens when things go wrong?
Right.
Like, what if a researcher, despite best intentions, does something unethical? What are the consequences?
Well, there are systems in place to address ethical violations.
Okay.
The APA Ethics Code that we talked about earlier
Yeah.
has a whole section on resolving ethical issues.
Okay.
There's procedures for reporting, investigating complaints,
Okay.
and researchers can face some pretty serious consequences
Okay.
if they violate those guidelines.
So it's not just a list of do's and don'ts, it's a whole system of accountability.
Right, exactly, like checks and balances
Right.
to make sure that research is conducted with integrity.
And it's important to remember that those guidelines are constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
Because new challenges are popping up all the time,
Yeah.
especially with technology like AI and all this research being done online now.
Yeah, it's like trying to hit a moving target. The
Yeah.
ethical landscape is always changing.
Right.
So researchers really have to stay informed about the latest guidelines
Nice.
and be open to adapting their practices.
Speaking of new challenges, we talked a little bit about this earlier, this idea of reporting research findings.
Mm-hmm.
And the textbook really emphasizes that ethical considerations don't stop once the data is collected.
Oh, absolutely not.
It also applies to how that research is shared with the world.
Yeah, we talked about authorship, giving credit where credit's due,
Right.
but there's also the issue of plagiarism,
Yes.
which can be a really tricky area.
You know, I think a lot of people have this misconception that plagiarism is only about copying and pasting someone's work word for word.
Right.
But it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Plagiarism can take many forms.
Okay.
Some are more subtle than others. Yeah.
But the main principle is the same. You can't present someone else's ideas or words as your own.
So let's break it down for our listeners. What are some common types of plagiarism that people need to be aware of?
All right, well, like you mentioned, there's that most blatant type, direct plagiarism.
Right.
Where you just copy someone else's work word for word
Yeah.
without giving them credit.
Uh-huh.
That was pretty straightforward.
Okay.
You know, you use someone else's words, you got to put them in quotes.
Okay.
You got to cite the source.
Okay, that one's pretty easy to understand. But what about paraphrasing?
Right.
If I'm putting someone else's idea in my own words,
Yeah.
do I still need to cite them?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Even if you're not using their exact words,
Yeah.
you still have to acknowledge where you got that idea from.
Okay.
Because paraphrasing without attribution
Yeah.
is still plagiarism.
Okay, so it's not just about avoiding word-for-word copying.
Right.
It's about recognizing that you're kind of in debt.
To the other researchers.
Yeah, you're building on their work.
Yep.
You know?
Giving credit where credit is due.
Exactly.
Even if you're putting things in your own words.
Exactly.
So then there's this thing called mosaic plagiarism,
Right.
which was kind of a sneaky form, right?
Yeah, a little bit sneaky.
Where you're taking bits and pieces
Right.
from different sources.
Yeah.
And you're patching them together
Right.
without properly citing them.
Yes.
It's like creating a Frankenstein's monster
Yeah.
of other people's ideas.
It is.
Okay.
And it's just as unethical as directly copying.
Okay.
Because whether you're doing it intentionally or you're just being careless, if you present that patchwork of other people's ideas as your own, that's a no-no.
Okay, so we've covered the big three: direct copying, paraphrasing without attributing, and mosaic plagiarism.
Right.
But what about those gray areas where you're not even sure if you need to cite something?
Right.
What if it's common knowledge?
Right.
Do you still need to cite it?
That's a great question. And like many things in ethics, it depends.
Okay.
If it's something that's very widely known in your field, you might not need to cite it.
Okay.
But if you're ever unsure, it's always better to err on the side of caution.
Okay.
And just cite it.
So when in doubt, cite it out.
Exactly.
Better safe than sorry.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to something as serious as plagiarism.
Right. And remember, even accidental plagiarism can have serious consequences.
Okay.
It can damage your reputation, your career,
Yeah.
and even undermine the integrity of your research.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some real-world examples of ethical dilemmas in research.
Right.
The textbook mentions a few case studies that illustrate these complexities.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think looking back at those historical examples can help us make more informed decisions.
It can. One that really stands out is the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Okay, yeah.
This was conducted in the U.S. from the 1930s to the 1970s.
Wow.
It's a chilling example of unethical research that had devastating consequences.
I've heard about this study, but I don't know all the details. Can you give us an overview?
So the study involved a group of African-American men who had syphilis.
Okay.
But the researchers didn't tell them their diagnosis.
Wow.
And they didn't offer them treatment.
Well,
they wanted to study the natural progression of the disease.
Wow.
But they did so at the expense of these men's health and well-being.
That's horrifying.
Yeah.
To withhold treatment from people.
Yeah.
That's a clear violation of human rights.
It is. And it's a blatant disregard for informed consent.
Right.
These men weren't given the opportunity to make a decision about whether or not they wanted to participate.
Wow.
They were used as guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent.
Such a tragic example.
It is.
Of how research can exploit vulnerable populations.
Absolutely.
I can't even imagine the lasting impact that had on the trust between the African-American community and the medical establishment.
Sure. The Tuskegee study left a dark stain on the history of research ethics.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of why we have ethical guidelines and why we have to protect research participants.
It's a lesson we should never forget.
Absolutely.
Moving on to another case study, the textbook also mentions the Stanford prison experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Conducted in the early 1970s.
Yeah.
And this one really highlights the power of social roles.
Yeah.
And how easily people can kind of fall into these patterns of abusive behavior.
It's a fascinating study, although a little disturbing.
Yeah.
The researchers set up this mock prison in the basement of Stanford.
Wow.
And randomly assigned students to be prisoners or guards.
Oh, wow.
To see how they behave in that environment and how those social roles influence their actions.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It kind of was.
Okay.
The study was supposed to last 2 weeks.
Right.
But they had to stop it after 6 days
Wow.
because the guards became so abusive
Oh.
and the prisoners were so distressed.
That's incredible.
It is.
It's a reminder of how quickly things can get out of control.
Absolutely.
And how easily people can slip into these roles.
Right. Those roles of power and abuse.
Yeah.
It raises ethical questions about the psychological harm that can be inflicted.
Right. Even though no one was physically hurt.
Right.
The psychological toll must have been immense.
Absolutely.
It makes you think about how researchers can study these important questions.
Yeah.
The power dynamics, the psychology of imprisonment, without crossing those ethical boundaries.
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Finding that balance
Right.
between advancing knowledge and protecting the well-being of participants.
It's not always easy.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like ethical decision-making is this constant process of weighing these competing values and navigating all these gray areas.
Absolutely, where there are no easy answers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, these case studies are definitely a reminder of why ethics are so important.
Yeah.
It's about more than just following the rules.
Right.
It's upholding these values.
Right.
Respect, integrity, responsibility
Yeah.
in the pursuit of knowledge.
Well said. Ethics is the foundation of good science.
Right.
It's what ensures that research is conducted in a way that's both rigorous and humane.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive into research ethics, I want to emphasize that these considerations, they're not just for scientists.
Yeah.
They're relevant to all of us.
They are.
We all face ethical dilemmas in our lives.
Absolutely.
Whether it's in our relationships, our careers,
Right.
our interactions with the world.
Yeah.
And the principles we've talked about today, respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice,
Yeah.
these can guide us in all aspects
Of our lives.
Yeah, they're like a compass
Okay.
that can help us navigate the complexities of human interaction,
Yeah.
And make choices that are both ethical
Yeah.
and compassionate.
So let's take a moment to think about how these ethical principles show up in our own lives.
Yeah.
Where do we see those gray areas? When have we faced those tough choices? And what can we learn from research ethics that can help us make more informed and ethical decisions in our own lives?
That's a great question.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the foundational principles of research ethics, the nuances of informed consent and deception, the challenges of animal research, the importance of responsible reporting, and even the ethical implications of historical research studies. But the conversation isn't over yet. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll delve even deeper into the ethical landscape of research and explore how these principles can guide us in making more responsible and compassionate choices in our own lives. Welcome back to our deep dive on research ethics. As we wrap up, I'm thinking about how all these principles, they can help us
Right.
make better choices
Yeah.
in our own lives.
It's fascinating how those principles, respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, they apply to everyday situations.
Right. It's like they're the threads that connect those ethical research practices to this larger framework for ethical living.
Yeah.
And it's not just about what's happening in the lab.
Right.
It's about how we treat each other and how we make decisions, how we navigate this world.
Absolutely.
Full of ethical challenges.
One of the things that really struck me while reading this chapter was the emphasis on responsibility.
Okay.
In research, it's not just about following the rules. It's about understanding how your actions impact others.
But like taking ownership.
Yeah, exactly.
Like being a good driver. Like you need to be aware of your surroundings.
Right.
And anticipate those problems and make those responsible decisions to keep everyone safe.
Absolutely. And in research, that means protecting the confidentiality of your participants, being honest about your methods, giving credit where it's due, recognizing that your actions have consequences, and conducting yourself with integrity.
Yeah, it's like building a culture of integrity.
Absolutely.
Within that community.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's essential for maintaining public trust.
Right, because if people lose faith in the process,
absolutely,
and they see it as unethical,
right,
then it undermines the whole thing.
Absolutely. It undermines the whole enterprise.
Right. And we're seeing that play out in real time, like with the vaccine hesitancy and climate change denial.
Exactly. When people don't trust the science, it can have serious consequences.
For sure.
For society.
So I guess that means researchers need to be more transparent about their work.
Yeah. They need to engage in open dialogue with the public and address concerns head on. It's about building those bridges between the community and the world. Showing people that science is a human endeavor.
Right. Showing people that they're human beings, too.
Right.
Trying to grapple with these questions.
Yeah. And make a positive impact.
Yeah, that's a good point. It brings us back to that idea that these ethical principles, they're for everyone.
They are.
So how can we apply what we've learned?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is critical thinking. Just like a researcher critically evaluates their work, we can all benefit from questioning our assumptions.
So it's about not taking things at face value and digging a little deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
Challenging ourselves to think critically about the information we're getting.
Yeah. Another important takeaway is empathy.
Okay.
In research, we're trying to understand the perspectives of our participants.
Right.
And in life, we can all benefit from that.
Right. Trying to see the world through other people's eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got critical thinking. We've got empathy.
Yeah.
What else?
And then I think the third takeaway is accountability.
Okay.
Just like researchers are accountable, we all need to hold ourselves accountable.
Right.
For our choices. Right. Own our mistakes, learn from them.
Strive to do better next time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Recognizing that our choices have consequences.
I like these takeaways.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that ethics isn't just this abstract concept.
Right.
It's something that should be present in all aspects of our lives.
It should. It's about being mindful.
Yeah.
Intentional.
Yeah.
And compassionate.
Yeah.
In the choices that we make.
And ethical decision-making isn't always easy, is it?
No, it's not.
There's times when we face these dilemmas.
Right.
With no easy answers.
Absolutely.
We have to grapple with those gray areas.
Yeah, but by having open dialogues, seeking different perspectives, staying grounded in those ethical principles, we can navigate those challenges with more awareness.
This has been a really incredible journey.
It has.
Into research ethics. We've learned about the foundations to the applications.
Yeah.
And I think we've come away with some really valuable insights.
Absolutely.
That can help us live better lives.
Yeah.
So thank you for diving deep with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And as always, thank you to our listeners.
Yes. Thank you.
We'll be back soon
with
another deep dive.